Thank you. Thank you, Udo. Why are you making me cry? Um, thank you. Thank you for welcoming me, and thank you for speaking in my language. It's an honor to be here. I feel like I'm among friends. Musa and Udo, the entire faculty, School of Architecture at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Thank you for this invitation. Thank you for supporting these young students. Thank you for supporting this NOMAS chapter. They are doing pioneering work. This is history in the making. I hope that they are aware of how impactful they are in changing this narrative. Africa's voice has always been heard. Now it really needs to be heard. So I thank you. I truly do. Nmadili spoke earlier today. He brought the passion that I saw almost 30 years ago now when he first presented, when I was first being introduced to African architecture. His presentation was priceless. I just cannot believe how he weaved the dots, connected the dots, took us from Mandela's cell. He spoke of a man by himself trying to make a difference. Solitary, quiet, suffering. He did have help, but from that cell, the world changed. And what's happening today and what NOMAS is doing today with this conversation of African architecture, it has been a very solitary journey. It's been painful. I think most of the students and some of you here know my story, how I started. It was a very, very solitary journey, wanting to have a conversation, this conversation with my friends, with my professors, and not being supported. Today, it is changing. UIUC, you are doing an amazing job with changing the narrative, supporting these young students and making sure that things will change, that students will not feel how I felt almost 30 years ago in design school, like someone who was not welcome to the classroom because their culture had nothing to contribute. I cannot thank you enough. The fact that Nnamdi was here, and I am here today sharing on the platform with him, and also sharing a space with Christian Coles and Dwayne Smith Alexander is incredible. Because what I know in this conversation, and as Africans have always done, is pass the torch. I stand on the shoulders of pioneers like Nmadili, like David Hughes, and like Dimas Wonko. I stand on their shoulders. Everything that I know, I got from them. And I was feeling very shy when my co-presenters were giving some shout outs to me, because truly I stand on their shoulders. And I am thrilled to pass the torch to the next generation. And it is Christian, it is Alexander, it is all of my friends and family at CPDI. It is Udo and Musa and their classmates. We are supposed to pass the torch, and that's what we're going to do today. What I'll do now with that is share my screen and jump into the conversation. Okay, if you can see the screen, I will get started.
Yes, we can.
Okay, my name is Nmadili Okwumabua, as Udo said, and I'm the founder of CPDI Africa. CPDI Africa stands for the Community Planning and Design Initiative Africa. It was launched in 2014 to promote this very conversation. Our idea was to bring about new languages for Africa and her diaspora, new architectural languages that were culturally and environmentally sustainable. That is, they preserve the story of Africa's cultures and traditions, and they solved problems that Africans and diaspora communities were facing in their own spaces. We've since launched Global Studio for African-Centered Architecture, actually this year in January. This lecture is titled African American Architecture Defined, New Design Philosophies, New Design Languages, New Curriculums. Why all of these things? We're talking about decolonizing the curriculums. We're talking about Black Lives Matter. We're talking about Africa Rising. All of these things come together for us in our profession for building the environment. For African peoples, what is that architectural language? What was it? What is it now? What can it be? And how can we bring that conversation to the academy? The issue has always been, there's not a body of knowledge. Africans may or may not have done anything to contribute to the discourse of world architecture, but that is not true. It is time for us to begin to have those conversations rightfully and respectfully. We have to start the conversation, therefore, with what is the definition of architecture? It is defined as the art and science of constructing a building. The extended definition, however, is where I stand. It is the reflection of the culture, lifestyle, aesthetics, local building materials, climate, geography, political and economic purchasing power of a people and a place. It is all of these things translated into the built environment that makes architecture. Therefore, if you were to visit any space, you would see the signature styles of their own architecture. It goes beyond the facade. It is not purely aesthetics, but aesthetics is the first thing that you see. It is when we go behind the walls that we know more about the identity of the people, what's important to them, hierarchy of space, spirituality. In these images, we can see the architecture of Asia. You land in that space and no one has to tell you where you are, you can identify. Holland, the gingerbread houses. India, the deities all over the facades of their buildings. America, the red brick McMansions, we know that. Dubai, architecture and opulence. Chinatown, anywhere. You land in that space, you know where you are. Because again, it is the aesthetics, the culture, identity. Materials, it's climate and geography. It's also, like I said, purchasing power of a people in a place. For example, Dubai. It is all of those things translated in their built environment that makes up architecture. And so when we speak of African architecture, what do we mean? Well, let us define. We have to start somewhere. Let's start with the map itself, the continent itself. I'm not sure how many of us actually realize how large Africa is. You see it on your regular standard maps. It looks like it's the same size or smaller than other spaces. I think we know that is wrong. I hope that most of us have seen this image before. Easily, the US fits into West Africa, China in the middle and the south, India in the east, Europe in the north, and there's still space remaining. This is the true size of Africa. And so when you speak of our architecture, you can imagine the plethora of design ideas, design ideologies, theoretical frameworks that will come out of that continent. My favorite maps, the one on the left shows Africa today, the 54 countries after colonial rule. We understand how in late 1800s, Europe divided the continent. And now we see these national identities that are based on the culture of those that colonized them: Germany, France, England, the Portuguese, and others. But the map on the right shows the true Africa, Africa in fact. All of those thousands of black lines represent the true peoples of Africa, the true nations of the continent. The Igbo, the Ashanti, Ndebele, Zulu, they go on, thousands of them. Those black lines represent them, and the red ones, the red superimposed lines, are those country lines. I kind of call those the fake countries, because that's not truly who Africans are. If you look at the area where Nigeria is, you can see lots of black lines. That is in the elbow of West Africa. That's because in Nigeria alone, there are over 250 ethnic groups. So when you talk about architecture for Africa, architecture for Nigeria, what are you actually talking about? Who are you speaking of? You can stand in any spot in Nigeria, take a mile trek in one direction, the language, fashion, food, music, spirituality will change. You come back to where you started out, turn 1 degree, take another mile out. The fashion will change, the food will change, the fashion, the architecture. That is how many languages we would have. Now, yes, some of them will be similar because they're close to each other, but many of them will be very distinct. This is what defining the languages of African architecture will look like. Some say, oh, it's going to be too much work. No. How exciting for those on the continent to have the opportunity to fast track the development of their own architectural languages. How exciting for others to join in understanding the architecture of Africa and also supporting in its development. So we think of Africa, and of course, the first thing that's going to come to mind is its architecture of antiquity, the monumental architecture. Pyramids of Egypt, Ethiopia's stone-hewn churches, Great Zimbabwe. When you think about the design briefs that resulted in this architecture, what were they? Those design briefs were responding again to the people. The design brief created for the pyramids in Egypt would result very different architecture if it were in China, if it were in Europe. You understand what I'm saying? The design briefs of these monumental buildings encapsulated the identity of the people. What was that? The nostalgic architecture of Africa. This is what most people think of when they think about the continent. Oh, it's mud, it's thatch, it's organic materials. Some say it's primitive. That's a very bad word. Actually, this is perfect architecture. Perfect. It's organic. It has no impact on the earth. CO2 emits 0. You build, it doesn't cost anything. It responds to the climate. You don't want it, you knock it back down, it goes right back into the earth. It's perfect architecture. But you can also see the aesthetics. You can see that it is architecture. It was designed. All 6 of these images are completely different, and they all speak to place. If you're familiar with these images, you would know exactly where they were. This is African architecture. And most people think, oh, one of these makes the house. No, it's often a collection of these rooms around an open courtyard that makes a family home. These individual spaces are simply rooms. It is a collection of them that makes a house or a home. Hut, very negative word. Also, when you think about African architecture, you think about its colonial identity. Like we all know, and I just said, when Africa was carved 100 years ago, and then of course before then, during colonization and slave trade, Europeans came to Africa and they brought their own culture. Arabs came before that and brought their own culture and spirituality. So you can travel anywhere on the continent and you will see architecture like this. You see mosques, you see churches made of materials that became local after being imported. You see images like the one on the far right, the Hilton in Abuja. Contemporary architecture, if you were to not know you were in Africa and you were in that space, you would think you were somewhere in Europe. But this architecture is actually African architecture now, because this is how most of the continent designs. But let's talk about Afrocentric architecture. I'll show just this one example. And this is the ECOWAS building in Lomé, Togo by architect Pierre Goudiaby Atepa. I love showing this because it says everything. Afrocentric architecture pulls from art, aesthetics again, materials, spirituality, all the things that are important to the people of the continent. They pull that into their work. And so what Pierre was doing when he got this opportunity to build his headquarters for the West African heads of state, he pulled on the meanings symbolized in these objects on the left: the Ghanaian stool, the Egyptian headrest. The Ashanti kings would sit on the stools. The pharaohs would rest their heads on these pillows. Hard, I would say, but they were pillows nonetheless. The pharaohs believed that their head should not rest on the ground because the head held wisdom. So their heads were elevated when they slept. These objects are seats of power. Pierre translated that power into his ECOWAS building, because after all, that is where the West African heads of state would meet to discuss important issues. So why wouldn't he draw inspiration from something he gets from the African environment? This is an example of Afrocentric architecture. You also see the pattern and motif going around the top of the building, and the conference center, which we don't see here, is shaped like an egg. And again, for those who know the meaning of an egg in African culture, that is a very powerful space. So why don't we see that kind of building all over the continent? For that, I'd like to tap into some of what Ele said in this morning's presentation. In the 50s and 60s, as Africans were getting their independence, it was the grand opportunity for them to say, well, let's define ourselves going forward in our true identity. It was an opportunity that unfortunately was missed because as the colonizers or colonial powers were leaving, they were setting up universities on the continent. And in these universities, students would go to pretty much learn how to become brown Europeans. In the case of architecture, that was exactly what happened. So you have students going to school to learn architecture, and what they're doing is learning that from Eurocentric perspectives. So no wonder they graduate and begin to build replicas of what they see in New York, in London, even as far away as Japan. The importance of the academy, as you can see, is critical. What are we teaching in our schools? What are we teaching the future generations and developers of our built environment? So with that, I will jump to African American architecture. African Americans are Africans in America. Some may argue. African Americans were Africans before they became African Americans. African Americans left the west coast of Africa 400 to 500 years ago in this instance, and they settled in the new lands, in the Americas, in Europe, and in Asia. But they carried within their DNA memory of who they were as Africans. As we saw on the first map, all of those ethnic groups and those Black lines have specific languages that they speak architecturally. And so for African Americans or Africans in the diaspora, it would be the same. What new cultures and identities, spiritualities, and design languages were developed or would be developed by those who have now settled in the new lands? African American architecture, therefore, will find its roots in African design. So, for example, in this image, again, we know Africans, for the most part, left West Africa. They came from all the ethnic groups along the West Coast, even in the hinterland, in the Congo areas. Some even came from Madagascar and South Africa. But they were transported to South America and to North America, again, carrying with them the memory of home. They settled in what we call the Black Belt. And for most of us, we know that's in the Carolinas, in Mississippi, and Georgia, Texas, Florida, right? If one were to experience those spaces, you will have a very clear understanding of what it could be to have Africa in America. But that's the Black Belt. This image I show because I love how Christian and Dwayne presented this knowledge, taking images of architecture from West Africa and the architecture that was built on the plantations once we landed. Putting those side by side, it would be very hard to tell them apart. It just begins to tell you that indeed the elements of design made it across the waters, and the story actually continued. It did not stop. The only difference between some of these buildings here that would tell you that these are not in Africa is because one or two of them have chimneys, right? So it's not cold in Africa. So those are kind of giveaways. But these buildings here are the Tata Somba, they're Haitian architecture, Jamaican, Yoruba, Congo, Hausa, Jar, Mississippi, and Igbo. This is where the story starts for African American architecture in the diaspora. From there, after emancipation, we built all the Black Wall Streets that are listed here. Unfortunately, we know the story. Most of them were destroyed, burned down, pulled down to build highways. Some of them were even flooded by dams, lots of horrible stories. But these communities were built before integration. After integration, people began to move for several reasons. The very few remaining of these communities have been disinvested. And we know all about that: gentrification, redlining. As a matter of fact, only 30% of Blacks still live in Black zip codes. 70% have left thanks to integration, thanks for looking for better opportunities. And that number is increasing, as we all know that the second wave, I think, of gentrification is going across the continent. Very soon, there'll be even fewer Blacks in Black zip codes. Well, let's talk about African American architecture, community planning, and the Africanisms that I like to say. And it's not my word, it's not mine, I use it. It's the best to describe this. The Africanisms that we see in African American culture that still connects it to Africa. Because it's those elements that if we're going to talk about creating diaspora design languages, we would have to use, because that's what will make the architecture different from European American architecture or Asian American architecture, right? What are those Africanisms that we're still practicing that we can see in our built environment? Well, I love telling this story because when I discovered Tuskegee, and I say discover because it was only a couple of years ago, I felt like I was going to a sacred space. Entering those gates, I felt somehow I had been transplanted back to Africa. Beautiful campus. But the story here is when Taylor was designing and building this school, they didn't have any money. How did they build it? The students and the teachers came together and they molded their clay blocks and they built their school. It was community engagement. Together, they built their school. And part of that labor was translated into tuition. So if you are coming together to build space because you need to, and that's part of your culture is working together, then you can actually achieve what Tuskegee achieved with Robert Taylor and Washington, right? It is a perfect example of how Africans actually built their societies. They worked together. It typically did not have a price tag attached. I show this image because it looks so much like it was inspired by the architecture of West Africa. This is the Oaks, home of Booker T. Washington, there in Tuskegee. Looking at it and looking at the images on the far right, you see the textures, the colors, the shapes. It truly seems to be inspired by West African architecture. I'm not sure, I don't have the details, but I'm wondering if this is an Africanism embedded in memory to pull on these shapes and forms. African American architecture, a quick survey. Again, we got to see some of this in the earlier presentations. Paul Revere. LAX theme building looks like it's right out of an Afrofuturism movie. Was he channeling that creativity? Another building of his, La Concha Motel in Las Vegas, the form, organic, the shape, what was inspiring him? Of course, Phil Freelon, now an ancestor. I remember his stories. He said when he would get an opportunity, he would place African art and other objects on the conference room table. He would have his staff and architects walk around and they would sketch and they will come up with ideas and they will be drawing inspiration from these African elements or aesthetics or artifacts, and they would use them in their buildings. I remember him saying this clearly. And when you think about this building specifically, also using Gullah Geechee patchwork patterns on the facade of his building, you think, okay, he really was doing this. He truly was succeeding in creating African-inspired buildings right here in the diaspora. Of course, Jack Travis, the Kalahari condominiums in New York, celebrating African pattern and motif. All it takes is one look and you ask, could this be African? Murals, graffiti, all typical African expressions on the facades of their buildings, family compounds, public spaces. Again, Jack Travis shows this. Stanley Love Stanley's church, Ebenezer Baptist. It doesn't get any more Afrocentric than this. Yes, it's a Christian building, but as you can see, he's pulling on the patterns and motifs of Ghana, West Africa. You can see those in the inside of his church. Every pillar, every column has a different pattern. And again, understanding the meanings behind these patterns, you know immediately what space you're in. These forms are inspired by Africa. On the final image here, this is the Lighthouse Catholic Student Center at Clark, Atlanta, obviously inspired by the stone-hewn churches in Lalibela, Ethiopia. Again, showing that it's very possible to channel Afrocentric architecture in diaspora space. But all of this is to prove, again, that those who were coming to the Americas were not just slaves. They were scientists, they were architects, they were mothers, fathers. Yes, they were farmers, they were children, they were teachers, but they carried the memory of Africa in their DNA. And they brought that to the New World and built the spaces now that they do not get credit for. All we think of when we think of African people coming to the New World was to farm, but they came with much more. This is actually a quote That's in the African Design Idea Competition that's happening right now in Africatown in Alabama. I hope that you all know about it. If not, please, please get engaged. An amazing event is about to take place in Africatown in Alabama, and it's all going to come from an Afrocentric architecture competition. So, what landscapes will we build after the battles against racism, injustice, and oppression have been won? Those are the conversations that we hear today in most of the talks about changing the narrative, decolonizing the curriculum. Yes, we do need to decolonize the curriculum. But once we have done that, and architects are being trained to now design freely, because architecture truly is coming from within, it is an art. Architecture is not a response to racism. What will we build? So that Afrofuturism is achieved by manifesting Africanisms embedded in the DNA of African American culture as the secret ingredient for cultural preservation and identification of sustainable solutions to challenges in our communities. Developing curriculums that empower future generations of Afrocentric architects is the end game. That is the end game, is to create architecture that preserves our story, that solves problems in our built environment. That is the end game. How do we do that? You can only begin to do that when you know the culture and the identity of the people. Okay, so that means that African-American elements of culture, aesthetics, spirituality, materials, and their development philosophies will have to be identified. If you're going to create African-American architecture, it cannot be the African or the Black version of European architecture. It will have to be the African-American version of that architecture. That means, what is the culture of the African-American? Again, it is that you translate into your built environment that gives you architecture. Otherwise, people can continue to argue that all Black architects do is copy the culture and aesthetics and the language of other cultures. So it becomes very important to identify those elements so that they can be translated in a way that we create a built environment that is unique, that is different, that is like what we saw with Pierre Atepa's building. Okay, so to start that conversation, we know that there are three things we're going to ask. We know that traditions and aesthetics that are inherent in Africanisms will come to the table. What are they? The African-American culture of injustice and racism, we understand that we'll have to respond to that. And then we're going to include the European culture that has been imbibed by African Americans just from being here, right? Whether you're in Jamaica, you're in Haiti, or you are on mainland. The other thing we'll respond to in creating this new language is remembering Sankofa. And that means to look back. Go back and take what was taken away. Go back and reclaim. It is not appropriation. It is actually reclaiming something that was yours. So go back and understand who one is as an African American or an African American, right? So look back and collect. Ubuntu, which means working together, right? Like what we saw at Tuskegee, learning how to work together again. This element becomes very important as you begin to create these new design languages for building up Black community. And of course, Afrofuturism is projecting that into the future, spiritually and communally, right? All of these three will have to come together in order for us to begin an authentic conversation of what African-American architecture would be in developing and building space. Of course, not forgetting the impact of social justice and equity, preservation, talking about gentrification. How do you respond to that? These are the elements that will form the foundation of creating this African-American language. Now, bringing this information into the academy, many again have said there is not a body of knowledge. Well, this is not true. If you want to start out courses that would teach this information so that these languages can be built, there is, favorite word, a plethora of resources. My favorite being Back of the Big House by John Michael. Reading that book, it was as if right there on the plantation, they truly had replicated Africa. So much was included in that. It's the only place that African Americans will start a story in creating that language that truly is unique. Like Smith said, and Cole said, we think about culture of the African American, we always think of rhythms and dance and beats. There is so much more, and that the artists have had the freedom to express their Africanness in their music. Well, how do you do that? Through architecture. Again, it's going back to the culture and how spaces are used. Reclaiming elements that have been culturally appropriated. Looking at this image right here, if one was aware of what was African in these images, one could say there is an African-American architecture. It exists and you can point to it because you know it. But if you don't know it, then when you see it, you will give it to the other culture. What I loved about Christian's presentation was when his student, in doing her research in Savannah, started finding Adinkra symbols everywhere. If she had not learned from him and had not done her research to know what African aesthetics look like, what those symbols look like, then when she saw them in the buildings throughout Savannah, then she would not know that that was Africa's contribution, or that she was looking at African aesthetics. So the first thing is to recognize, right? What is the African aesthetic? So when you see it in the built environment, you can point to it and reclaim it and start your conversation on solid ground. And so creating these languages, I would say, like I do with CPDI, and we'll look at some of those images, one would start like a kit of parts, right? You would begin these conversations in classrooms, design competitions, workshops, think tanks, design charrettes, all to perfect a theoretical framework, right, for creating these languages. And it will be more about culture and less about racism. Again, racism is not at the root of architecture. That is something that we experience, yes, but taking racism off of the table, what would one create? One would begin to respond from a cultural place, a cultural perspective. It would be that and less racism. So for example, this image, go online and you say Africanisms. This is an image I typed in just Google African-American paintings, and this image came up. I recognized the patterns and the colors, and I knew this is Black art. I typed in African paintings, and this image came up. These images came up. It was the same thing. What was slightly different is that on the African paintings, you begin to start seeing patterns and motifs emerge, just because of them having, hundreds and thousands of years to create and to label these and to begin to be identified with what image is what aesthetic goes with what culture. For example, the Ashanti are known for their Adinkra, the Igbos are known for Uli. Okay, so going back to the African American, you can see that it's beginning to come out in the art. And I want to say again, Africanisms, it's in the DNA. How much time will it take for all of a sudden African American artists to begin to create patterns and name them and be identified by them? Just like what we see here on the African image. Going to culture, if you look at these 4 images, what is similar about them? Again, culture. It is what your people or your community needs. That is what the architects will build. If you don't need it, it won't get built. These 4 images, as you can see, everybody's outside. The 2 images on the far left are in the diaspora, and the 2 on the right are in Africa. There's a barbecue outside, there's a wedding outside. Top right, there's a wedding in Africa outside, and then there's a festival. What's the architecture for eating outside? What's the architecture for a festival outside? What's the architecture for a wedding outside? Well, because the weather was perfect and that belief in nature really believing in spending and living life outside, a lot of architecture really wasn't created. You did build palaces, you built your shrines, you built your houses, but just about everything else happened outside. That love for nature, the love for the sun. What architecture would you create if you really were putting culture first? There might not be a lot of building going on. But just going to put that on the table because I don't want to take food out of the architects' mouths. Aesthetics, once again, we saw some of these images already, patterns and color, and the community being engaged in beautifying the spaces that they inhabit, whether it's public or private. These are African Americans, these are Africans, as we see them painting graffiti and uli on these surfaces. This image right here, spirituality. We see water. Water is always involved in spiritual practice. The far two are, there's one African American and one African pouring libations. How do you design architecture that responds to pouring libations? What does that mean? You're pouring space over where an ancestor is laid to rest, right? What are these Africanisms that if you're talking about creating a new language that's coming from Africa? How would you begin to bring that into the classroom to speak about it, and of course, into the practice? Materials, the use of local materials, sustainable materials. We see a lot of that. This is an example from Howard University. It's American architecture. Most people, yes, build with local materials. Not so much the case now in Africa, but in this case, we're speaking of what would we build, what will we emphasize, what will we specify if you're building in a community that's being mindful of the climate, mindful of the planet, and definitely mindful of costs, right? How can we use readily available local materials to create architecture? And the last one, which is very important, is working together, that design philosophy of community, coming together and saying, we don't have to raise so much money. If we want something, we can actually build together. And that's building off of an African design or building principle. I like to get the story of Millard Fuller from Habitat, who got the idea when he was in the Congo in the 40s, right? Watching some people build a community home for someone, and the light kind of goes off and he says, you know what? He comes to America and he starts Habitat for Humanity. And what is that? It's the church or the community coming together to build housing for those who are less fortunate. It could be for anybody. Anybody could come together and stay in their community. We need to build somebody a new home, or we need to fix a roof, or help someone to take care of their lawn, or build a new community center. The community can actually come together and build. And that's just building off of an old African design philosophy of working together, Ubuntu, in other words. Well, what I've done with all of this information, like I said, standing on the shoulders of so many who have come before me, this year we launched the Global Studio, CPDI Africa's Global Studio for African-Centered Architecture. And it's a virtual space where designers from all around the world can come in to learn this information, to begin to see how this can be brought, yes, to mainstream, to the mainstream academy, and to be used in just solving a lot of the problems that we're facing now globally in the built environment. So our teachers, they're multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, teach on art and design and architecture, philosophy, aesthetics, everything that goes into what architecture truly is. We build upon the research of scholars. Like I said, I'm not alone in this conversation. I stand on the shoulders of many. Dimas Wonko, who's Nigeria's premier Afrocentric architect. Once again, the ancestor Philip Freelon. We've seen one of the works from Pierre. Mariam Kamara is the new architect who's making waves in Afrocentric architecture. My dearest mentor, David Hughes. We saw the presentation today from Nmadili. His book, African Architecture, Evolution and Transformation, was one of the Bibles in the 90s when this conversation became mainstream. His book and that of David Hughes, Afrocentric Architecture, a design primer. These are must-haves for every student and professor who is entering Afrocentric design. And of course, I have also my first boss, William Stanley, whose work was inspired by the research that came out of David and Nnamdi's work. So there is a wealth of knowledge out there that can be brought to the classroom, and what we teach at the design studio, the Global Center for African-Centered Architecture, is built upon their works and many more, and many more. What we do is bring this information so that students in schools like, University of Illinois and all the schools in the US and in Africa, there's a space now for them to get this kind of information, and they can bring it back to their classrooms and include that in their design projects, begin to solve some of the problems that they're going to face when they graduate and go back to their own communities, right? Professors, those who are looking to teach architecture, now have a resource, right? They can take our classes and finally begin to know those who are making a difference, who are researching, and who are creating architecture that is culturally sound and environmentally sound, and captures that African story. Professionals who are doing their design briefs, and individuals who are working on projects that they want to celebrate their culture and they want to preserve their own heritage. There is a space now for them to get this information. And of course, the end goal is to have all that we're doing at the Global Studio become mainstream, be incorporated into the curriculums in schools, not just in Africa, but also in the diaspora. We started out running competitions. That's actually how CPDI launched in 2015. We have run 3 design competitions, and the goal was to perfect this conversation through design charrettes, right? Once we could perfect it, then we could scale up. But we wanted to have an idea, is it truly possible to translate Black culture or African culture in the built environment? So we started there. My last couple of slides are some of the submissions, just so you see what that is. 2017, one of our winners, actually 2 guys, Olalekon and Olalekon Gold, submitted this design called the Eton, a multi-purpose building, live, work, play. They drew inspiration from the gourd, the calabash, which is popular all around the continent. It's used as a drinking gourd. It also has a lot of spiritual meaning attached. But as you can see, they drew inspiration. The cladding of their building was also organic, wood and timber, again, being very sustainable. Another building that was submitted, or design that was submitted, was called the Mask, done by a Russian civil engineer. She drew inspiration again from objects in African culture, just as we saw with Pierre Atepa. She used 4 masks for her building. Each facade was influenced by a different mask. She used all the organic materials. She used clay, she used stone, she used wood. She also used cement. But the building was very symbolic. You can see this can be used not just for a house, which is what she submitted it for. This could be anything. It could be a gallery, it could be a museum, it could be a community center. You could scale up. But these submissions were to show that it is possible, and that our African architecture can evolve to be more than what typically people would think of. It has to be a clay building with a thatch roof. Again, this is another elevation of the Mask. We use them in a series of posters to celebrate Black Panther, again, to let designers know that the narrative is changing. You're having films like Wakanda coming out. Now there's a part 2 coming to America, just came out. What's the architecture for such spaces? You're talking about Afrofuturism. What does it really look like? And so we applied or superimposed some of the superheroes in front of our designs, just to give designers an idea. This truly would be where the conversation starts. Patterns and motifs, again, in materials. And I encourage all of you all to visit our website to see more of these. But again, if you're familiar with the aesthetic of Africa, when you see it in the built environment, you can give it credit or give credit to it. What we do also is take our submissions around in the Art of African Architecture exhibition. It's traveled all around the world, and we are just really thrilled to say that it has been very well received. In the beginning of the conversation, people felt they were afraid that what we would see would just be grand huts with thatch roofs, and people would be very upset and say and call it primitive. But what they see in our exhibitions makes them proud to be African and proud of their culture. People have truly enjoyed. And I would like to say that if you want to hear them in their own voices, please visit our social media handles like the Facebook here, and you will see and hear them doing their research and submitting. These are truly masterpieces. We've also got a publication for download on our site. This one right here is over 100 pages of amazing research in architecture that was submitted. My last couple of slides just say that if we are going to create that architecture, we don't have to look far. We've seen this building before. Freelon and his partners that designed this masterpiece, they pulled from African precedent. It is very possible to do this. The image on our left is the Yoruba post with the deity there wearing her corona. The images in the bottom right are Nigerian ladies or West African ladies wearing their gele, which is the fancy headdress that's worn today. And you can see how it just ties so beautifully well with the Smithsonian Museum for African American Culture and History. If Phil could do that, then we can do this. I love this one. This is my last slide. Cicely Tyson in her fabulous hat. I would love to see design students take this into the studio and create a monumental piece of architecture. I want to thank you all for allowing me to speak and share my story once again. Udochukwu and Musa, thank you. And the same to the School of Architecture.